chasing money is actually keeping you poor. What do I mean by that? Well, for many years in my early 20s, mid 20s, I used to think, like many of you watching this, that the more money I made, the more successful I would become. And I think growing up, we're kind of taught this in school and in university, and oftentimes from our parents we hear, work hard, get a job, work your way up the ladder, get a promotion, a pay rise, and the more money you make, the happier you'll be, you'll have more options, etc, etc. And for 25, 28 years of my life, I thought this was true. The more money I made, the more happy I would become. And for me, growing up, from sort of 17 to early 20s, 22, 23, I was playing football. So I did my apprenticeship at Crystal Palace. So I was around a lot of high income earners, professional footballers. Those were my peers. So I would watch them and look at their lifestyles and their fancy cars and big houses and nice watches and things, and think, that's the goal, that's what I want to become. And at the time I was chasing the dream of being a footballer, so I was doing everything I could to become one of those professional senior players in the team, right? And it wasn't until I got a bit older, I'd say late 20s, my football career had fizzled out. By 23, 24, I was playing non-league football, getting a couple £100 a week, if that, towards the end. And I got to my later 20s and realised that chasing money wasn't really the correct goal to aim for. And there's a few things that made me realise this, but I guess a couple things that spring to mind were, oftentimes I would hear stories about some of the senior players in the football team at Crystal Palace going broke when they'd finished their career. So they'd get to like 35, sometimes 32, 33, and I'd hear stories about them being bankrupt and having like gambling addictions or just high expense lifestyles that didn't allow them to pivot or make money once they finished their career, because their expenses were so high. Having 2, 3, 4 fancy cars, a huge house, big mortgages, buying all the designer clothes every week, going out to West End clubs, spending thousands of pounds on tables, trying to impress city girls. A lot of footballers were going broke, and people I had looked up to in my sort of late teens when I was at Crystal Palace, well, mid-teens, were depressed and needing counselling to help them with their mental health by 30, 35. So that was something that definitely stood out to me, because I was thinking, well, I idolise these guys, but some of them are getting to 30, 35 and they haven't got much to show for it. They've played in the Premiership for years, but because they haven't been smart with their money, they're in the same position as someone who is pretty much on the dole. They've got these high expenses and they haven't got the money coming in anymore to cover those expenses. They haven't got any other skills in terms of working another job or creating a business, starting a business for themselves. They haven't invested into assets that will pay them passive income forever, so they're kind of stuck, you know. The only skill they have really is to kick a ball around. And that was definitely a lesson something that I noticed and thought, something's not quite right here. And then with myself, throughout my late teens, early 20s, I was trying to keep up with the guys that were playing in the first teams, and I was living way beyond my means, you know. I think at my peak in my football career, I was probably earning a couple grand a month, $3 grand a month, maybe $4 grand in my peak. Playing for some non-league teams that were paying quite well at the time, and I didn't know what to do with that money, so I was doing what I saw all my peers do growing up, and I was stretching myself, trying to live a lifestyle that was beyond me, to be honest. I had a Mercedes, I had a Rolex, I was going to West End nightclubs every week, spending £500 a table, £1,000 on a table, and just running through the money basically that I didn't really have, you know. I hadn't made it yet, so I should have really been investing that money either back into myself or investing in assets, you know. But I didn't know any better, right? So I was just trying to copy what all the first team players were doing. Champagne lifestyle, lemonade budget. But yeah, it wasn't until I got to like my mid sort of 20s, as my football career started to die down, till I realised that something wasn't right here, you know. Maybe there was a lesson in the fact that many of my peers were going bankrupt and broke, and there was a lesson that I didn't have much to show for someone who had been making £500, £600, £700 a week, at some stages £1,000 a week, for a good few years, and I had not much to show for it other than a Mercedes on finance and a bimetal Rolex. So that kind of got me thinking, going into my mid to later 20s, that whatever I was doing up until then wasn't working right, and it wasn't working for people making more than me either. So maybe we were aiming at the wrong thing. And I think it was at that stage where I kind of started to read more about wealth. I started my rent-to-rent business at around 28. But before I started it, I was reading books and trying to gather knowledge about running your own business and money and wealth. And it was when I read Rich Dad Poor Dad that definitely changed my perspective on money. There's a few books that I read that changed my perspective on money, but it wasn't just the books, it was also the experiences. So I started my rent-to-rent business in 2018, and for those of you who don't know what rent-to-rent is, it's when you rent a property from a landlord, you give it a cosmetic refurbishment, and then you rent it out for a premium. And it's a service-based business. You guarantee rent to landlords, and you improve the value of the property by painting, decorating, furnishing and marketing it better than the landlord, and that's how you attract premium tenants or guests to pay you more than what you're paying the landlord, right? So good business model. Didn't need a lot of money to get started. I think I had around £6,000 saved when I started that business. But what I learned when I started that business was, because I was working for landlords and I was providing a service to them, I got to be close to them and speak to them often. And some of these landlords were portfolio landlords, right? So people that owned 4, 5, 6, 7, 10 properties. And oftentimes I'd speak to them so often that we'd almost become friends, and I'd pick their brains and try and work out how they've got their money and how they managed to save up for deposits and invest so much money into property, and how they've managed to be financially secure and stable for the last 20-30 years. Most of these landlords were in their 50s, 60s. So I learned so much from these people just by picking their brains and almost being like their apprentice, right? Because I'm doing a service for them so that they can have passive income and not have to worry about managing tenants or managing their properties. And because they got value from that service, they'd often take me under their wing and give me tips and just answer my questions when I'd ask them and guide me, you know. So I got to start my own business, learn how business works, make more money than I was making playing football, but also I got to learn from wealthy people how to get wealthy and stay wealthy, more importantly, right? And there's a few things that those types of people do that the normal working class, middle class, lower class person doesn't think of doing. It's completely different behaviors, right? It's literally night and day. So some of the main things I learned from these wealthy landlords were, it's not about how much money you make, it's how much you keep. And I used to hear that phrase and I never really understood it until I started working for landlords. And I realized that some of them were millionaires, asset millionaires, right? And they used to live quite frugally. They weren't spending hundreds of thousands of pounds on 4 or 5 fancy cars. They didn't have a big massive house with a swimming pool and a cinema room and all this sort of stuff. They had hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of pounds invested in investment property that they rented out for an income. But for the most part, they lived quite frugally. They didn't really spend money on clothes and designer trainers and watches, jewelry, that sort of stuff. They were quite frugal. So that was the first lesson that I learned, that people with real wealth, they don't really care about impressing other people. They literally invest as much money as possible into assets as quickly as possible. Like, as soon as they get it, they invest it. And that was one of the first lessons that I learned, was that it's not about how much you make, it's how much you keep. And the way you keep your money is you invest it before you spend it. Before something happens, a unexpected cost pops up, or an emotional decision gets made, a holiday, a birthday, you borrow money to someone, an impulsive purchase happens, they just get the money, invest it straight away. And what happens is the money starts to compound in the asset, and the asset goes up, and then they also get a passive income from the asset. And then the next lesson I learned was, they never sell the assets. rather than sell the assets, which would be a taxable event, so you'd pay tax on the profit you'd make from selling an asset, rather than sell the asset, these wealthy landlords would refinance the asset. So they'd take more debt out against the asset when it goes up in value, and then that money that they get would be tax-free because it's a loan, right? It's more debt. So they get to keep the asset, they get to realize the gain as it appreciates. They don't pay any tax on that gain. They get passive income. The tenants pay the mortgage payment, and every time they refinance, they use that money to, guess what, invest again and build their portfolio and keep scaling without paying tax. So that was like the second lesson I learned, was wealthy people, they refinance their assets and they use debt as a tool to grow and scale their net worth, whereas middle class, lower class people, working class people, we're always told that debt is a bad thing. Growing up, I thought debt was terrible because, for the most part, consumer debt, which is what probably my mum and dad would have experienced and been in, more so than good debt, was a bad thing. High interest credit cards, payday loans, these types of things, even loans for nice cars, high interest rates. This is all bad consumer debt. But wealthy people use debt as a tool, and if the vehicle that they're putting the debt into or against is accelerating at a faster pace than the percentage of the debt, the interest on the debt, then that's what good debt is. You borrow more money against an asset, tax-free money. The asset goes up by 5%. It also pays you 10% per year from the rental income, so you make 15%, but you've borrowed money at 5%. So they remortgage at 5% and put that money into an asset that goes up and pays them 15%, and then they net the 10%, right? Tax-free. So that was the second thing I learned, that there's a difference between good debt and bad debt, and debt is just money and money is a tool. So if you can see debt as just money and money is a tool, then you should use good debt to grow and scale your net worth. It's just a tool, right? It's not something to be scared of. There's just a huge difference between consumer debt, debt that you take out for things and stuff. Again, going back to my first point, impressing other people who you barely know, who don't really care about you, trying to keep up with the Joneses, versus taking out good debt against assets that are going to appreciate at a faster rate than the interest on the debt. So that was quite profound for me, you know, learning that wealthy people are generally quite frugal, and two, that they understand the difference between good debt and bad debt, and they use good debt as a tool to grow and scale their net worth. So these are things that I started to learn when I started working for landlords in my rent-to-rent business, right? So two very different mindsets. And the third thing that I learned from these wealthy landlords was they're optimized for freedom as opposed to money. So their goal is to have time freedom, geographical freedom, financial freedom over making as much money as possible, right? Because when you chase money and you try and make as much money as possible, oftentimes what that looks like is a high paying job, 40, 50, 60 hour work weeks. And if you're chasing money, you're always chasing that promotion, that pay rise, that company car, whatever it is, whatever incentive it is to make you feel like you're earning more money. The thing is, when you earn more money, you pay more tax. So if you go from 50 to 100,000 pounds salary, then you pay 40% tax on that salary, and you also have to work 40, 50, 60 hours for that. Whereas wealthy people, because they're optimized for freedom, they're not chasing money, they're chasing freedom. So they make money, yes, of course, they have to, normally in a business or from investing, because as a business you pay corporation tax, and you can, which is 20% or 25% now, and you can control how much tax you pay because you have business expenses that you can deduct from your profit. You don't get that privilege when you're an employed person or a self-employed person. So they either make money through a business, which is more tax efficient, and you normally have more time freedom once you've built a business, because the systems and the employees make the money for you, rather than you having to go and trade 40 hours, 50 hours, 60 hours a week for the money. Your employees and your systems make the money for you, so you have a lot more time freedom. But wealthy people either make money from their business and investments, like property. You put your money in, it pays you a passive income, recurring, and it goes up in value over time. When it goes up, you refinance it, take out more good debt against it, and which is tax-free, and then you use that money to go and buy another asset, and you keep growing and scaling your net worth like that. So the third lesson I learned from wealthy people is they're not trying to get a promotion or get a pay rise at a job, which will in turn make them pay more tax and also take away from their freedom, make them have to work longer hours. They try and make more money within a business, which will ultimately give them more freedom, because you only have to work a couple hours a day in a good business. Once you're making 3, 5, 10 grand a month, you can start employing people and building systems to make that business work without you in it. They're making money from their businesses, and they're investing in assets that are going to go up in value as the tide rises, as the housing market values rise, their wealth rises, and rather than selling the asset, which is a taxable event, they refinance and take out good debt against the asset to buy more assets, which then also pay them more passive recurring income, go up in value, and compound their wealth over time, right? So those are the three main lessons that I learned in my late 20s that I think have really set me up for the rest of my life, really. And I learned these lessons by starting my first business, my rent-to-rent business, working under landlords, working for them, providing a service for them, and picking their brains and learning how they keep most of their money and scale and grow their money and their net worth by working less than your average working class, middle class person. So the three main lessons, just to summarize, guys: real wealthy people, true wealthy people, they're not trying to keep up with the Joneses. They don't have 5 supercars, a mansion, and all the designer clothes and all the designer trainers. Really wealthy people, they don't do that stuff. They're frugal. They invest most of their money because they understand that's the best place to put money into assets, and keeping up with the Joneses is a mug's game that will make you broke very quickly. So that's the first lesson I learned. Wealthy people are frugal. The second lesson I learned was there's a huge difference between good debt and bad debt. Debt isn't bad if you use it correctly. If you use debt and put it into something that's gonna grow your net worth more aggressively than the interest on the debt, that's good debt. That's a good thing. That's a good decision. Debt is a tool. Debt is money. Money is a tool. Use it. Use it smartly. So that's the second lesson I learned. The difference between good debt and bad debt. And the third lesson I learned from wealthy people is that freedom is the goal, not money. If you stop chasing money and you start chasing freedom or attracting freedom, that's where your abundant, happiest self will exist. Where you don't have to answer to anyone, you don't have to worry about getting fired at work, you haven't got to deal with any office politics, you're not waiting for someone to pay you. You can build a business that makes money for you and invest in assets that pay you passively forever. That's how you get freedom. So wealthy people chase freedom, they don't chase money. They're not chasing a higher paying job, a bonus, because that makes them A, pay more tax, and two, takes away, or B, takes away from their freedom, right? So those are the three main lessons that I learned in my late 20s from starting my own business. I thought I'd share them with you. I think they've set me up for life. I've just copied the people ahead of me. I've copied those landlords that I worked for in my late 20s. I'm now in my, well, mid to late 30s now. I've been doing this for the last 8 years. My rent-to-rent business is doing well. I also have a property e-learning business that's doing pretty good, and I have a portfolio of assets that I rent out and that go up in value, right? So those lessons that I learned in my late 20s, I think stand me in pretty good stead for the rest of my life, you know? And it was those three main points that I mentioned that really changed how I thought about money, how I thought about success, and how I wanted my life to really be, you know? Freedom is the goal. Money is not the goal. We're taught that money is the goal, but that's wrong. You need to optimize your life for freedom. And you do that by following those 3 steps that I've mentioned and changing your perspective, shifting your mindset from the middle class, lower class, hamster wheel, 9-to-5 life that most of us are taught. And you need to copy the behaviors of wealthy people, the 5 to 10% of people in the world that are completely free from the system because they own businesses, they buy assets, they live frugally, they understand the difference between good debt and bad debt, and they're optimized for freedom, not money. So I hope you found this video useful, guys. I'm just sharing some of the lessons I've learned over the years. Hopefully they can help you. And if you want me to help you build your rent-to-rent business or grow your rent-to-rent business, I'll put a link in the video description below. Click the link, book a call, we'll have a chat, see if we're a good fit for each other. If not, that's fine. If so, then I'll happily help you build your rent-to-rent business and replicate the same success that I've had. I hope you've enjoyed this video, guys, and as always, I'll see you on the next one.